We like to think God is a nice father who's sitting on a throne, giving us all kinds of gifts and blessings. We don't like to think about the God that judges, God that punishes, and the God that disciplines us. Now, why am I talking about the justice from God and fear from Him? Well, without fear for God, you won't be fearful of what will happen to you when you commit a sin. Just because you love God doesn't mean He will stop sinning. Fear of God is what gets you to hate and acknowledge sin. You can compare this to real life. Why do we try not to commit a crime in real world? It's because you have fear from the punishments that could happen to you. This is the same with God. If you don't have fear for Him, you won't be scared of the justice God will bring upon you, which will lead you to committing sins without a second thought. What is the fear of the Lord, though? What does it mean to fear Him? Why do we need to fear Him? What happens if we fear Him? Let's take an example. From the year 2000, we have found that an increase of over 40 million people have turned away from God. Now, when you would ask them, they would respond with all kinds of different answers. But the true reason is because they had no fear of God. It's simple. You may always assume fear as a negative subject, but not all fear is bad. Fear is what's keeping you from fooling around. It keeps you from doing stupid stuff. Just like how we have fear for punishments from crimes that we can commit. Now, there is one thing we need to keep in mind. Fearing God is not being scared of Him. Fearing God is always thinking about something like hell and death. In the Bible, it shows that before God shows His love, He shows His holiness. Exodus chapter 20 verse 20 says this. Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Now, from this verse, track back to chapter 19. It says, Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it was like a smoke from a furnace. The whole morning, too. Trembled with fear, as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke the voice of God and answered him. This explains that God was showing His holiness before anything else. However, they were afraid of Him, not fearful, but scared. Now, what does it mean to fear God? There are two things. Number one, to tremble at His presence. Psalms 89 verse 7 says this, God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints, and to be held in reverence by all those around Him. This verse is talking about the presence of fear from God that comes to them. Without respect for God, you will never find Him. When we show God the utmost respect and tremble at His presence, that's when the Holy Spirit moves. When you come to worship, do you tremble at His presence? Or do you might think you're just doing good because you're worshiping Him? But do you really hunger for Him? Or are you just waiting for the worship to end? A lot of people might doubt this, but retreats, mission trips, and all those kind of stuffs are not the only things where you can save and be encountered by God. Every week you go to church, you actually have a golden opportunity to meet Him. Number two, to tremble at His word. Isaiah 66 verse 2 says this, But this is the one whom I look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word. What does it mean to tremble at His word though? It does not mean literal fear of God's truth, but instead, it means to put it into action. Meditate and dwell in it. And as we do, we put it into action in obedience. There's 4 obedient factors we commit to ourselves when we have a fear of God. Number 1, immediate obedience. Even delayed obedience is disobedience in front of God. When God is speaking to you, you must obey immediately. Number 2, obedience even if it makes no sense. You might protest that whatever God is talking to you about won't make any sense at all. But keep in mind that this is a God that is incomparable to anyone. So obey even if it doesn't make sense. Number 3, obedience even if it induces pain. Do not obey things that are only advantageous to you. Number 4, obey completely. Do not obey and take a portion out of it and disobey the rest. Don't pick and choose obedience, which is exactly what Saul did in the Bible. If you recall what he did for the killing of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel chapter 15, you can see that Paul disobeyed the Lord by not devoting everything to destruction, but the animals for sacrifice. This is considered disobedience because God told him to destroy completely everything, but Saul left out the animals. So, what is the result of fearing God? There are two noticeable results from having a holy fear of God. Number 1, friendship with God. Psalms chapter 25 verse 14 says this: "Friendship with the Lord is reserved for those who fear him, but with them he shares the secret of his covenant." But friendship is not easy. In the Old Testament, there were only two people who were called a friend of God, and that was Moses and Abraham. Being a friend of God means you have to do whatever he commands. Just like how you would most likely share secrets with your own closest friends, God will only share his secret covenant to those who are intimate to him. Number 2, removal of every other fear. Psalms chapter 112 verse 7 to 8 says this: "And they have no fear of bad news, for their hearts are steadfast, their hearts are secure, and they will have no fear." This means that every worldly fear you have, it will be erased when you have a fear of God. Think about it. By fearing God, it will make you realize that God will protect you no matter what, including your fears. So, you will not have to worry about your fears anymore. Hey, but I still don't have a clear mind for fearing the Lord. Well, it's simple, really. Obeying him. Like we said earlier, obeying in him immediately, completely, and even if it has no benefit. Understand biblically that the way to fear the Lord is by believing in Jesus, acknowledging him as God, and joyfully obeying in him. Remember that fearing God is to stand in awe of him, not being scared of, but being humbled of. So, the next time you do as a sin, and you know what you're about to do, think twice and imagine God next to you, which you will probably have second thoughts to sin about.